A billionaire boards his private jet and finds a little girl sitting in his seat clutching a teddy bear, then she whispers, "This seat is the closest to the sky. That's where my mom is." The cabin was filled with that familiar hum of pre-flight routine, the low murmur of passengers settling into their seats, the rustle of luggage in overhead compartments, and the calm, rehearsed tones of flight attendants offering champagne and practiced smiles. It was an early morning flight to New York, one of those business-class trips that promised quiet, efficiency, and distance from the chaos of the world beyond the tinted windows. For Andrew Blake, it was supposed to be another uneventful flight, another few hours suspended between deadlines and deals, another piece of his life that looked perfect from the outside but felt empty inside. He adjusted the cufflinks on his dark blue suit, checked his watch, and made his way down the aisle toward his assigned seat, 3A, the window seat he always chose because it gave him control over what he could see and when he could look away. But when he reached it, he stopped short. Someone was already there. At first, he thought there must have been a mistake. A small figure sat curled up in the seat, her feet barely touching the floor, her arms wrapped around a worn stuffed bear with one button eye. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, wearing a light pink dress that seemed too thin for the cool air of the cabin. Her golden blonde hair fell in loose waves around her face, and she was staring out the window as if the world beyond the glass was calling to her. Andrew blinked, unsure what to do. "Excuse me," he said finally, his voice even but uncertain. "I think you're in my seat." The girl didn't respond. She didn't even look at him. Her small hand stroked the teddy bear's fur, her gaze fixed on the clouds that had yet to form outside. A flight attendant appeared beside him almost instantly, smiling with the kind of polite efficiency reserved for first-class inconveniences. "Oh dear," she said softly, leaning toward the girl. "Sweetheart, you can't sit here. Let's find your mom or dad, okay?" It was then the girl spoke, her voice so quiet that Andrew almost didn't catch it. "This seat is the closest to the sky," she said, still looking out the window. "That's where my mom is." The flight attendant froze. The air around them seemed to still, the easy rhythm of business travel replaced by an invisible weight. Andrew felt his chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt in years. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came. The attendant hesitated, then crouched down beside the girl. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "is your mom?" The girl just nodded. One slow, deliberate nod that said more than any words could. She hugged the teddy bear tighter, burying her face in its soft head. The attendant straightened, her smile fading into something uncertain. Andrew felt everyone around them fade into background noise, the conversations, the clicking of seatbelts, the flight safety announcements. It was just him and this small, fragile being sitting in his seat, holding onto something invisible and sacred. He could have walked away. He should have walked away. He could have asked for another seat or let the crew handle it. But for reasons he couldn't name, he didn't move. "It's all right," he said quietly, before he even realized he'd spoken. "She can stay." The attendant turned to him, clearly confused. "Sir, you don't have to." "I know," he interrupted, his voice firm now. "It's fine." He watched as the little girl looked up at him for the first time. Her eyes were blue, startlingly blue, like the reflection of the sky after rain. They were the kind of eyes that carried too much understanding for a child, too much loss. She didn't smile, but something in her gaze softened, as if she recognized in him a sadness that matched her own. He sat down beside her, feeling strangely out of place, and for a long time neither of them said anything. When the plane began to taxi toward the runway, she whispered, almost to herself, "Do you think she can see me from up there?" He swallowed hard. "I'm sure she can," he said, though he didn't believe in such things anymore. The engines roared, the cabin lights dimmed, and the world outside blurred into streaks of silver and gray. The moment the plane lifted off the ground, the girl closed her eyes and pressed her bear against her heart, whispering something so faint that it was lost beneath the hum of the engines. Andrew leaned back in his seat, staring at her small figure beside him, and something inside him shifted. For years, he had flown without feeling, without thought, just another businessman in another seat in the sky. But now, sitting next to this little girl who believed her mother was somewhere among the clouds, he felt the stirrings of a memory he had buried long ago, the sound of his own son's laughter, the scent of his wife's perfume, the unbearable silence that had followed when they were gone. He turned toward the window, blinking hard, and for the first time in 5 years, he let himself look at the sky. The seatbelt sign chimed off, and the attendants began moving down the aisle with practiced smiles, offering drinks and warm towels. The girl didn't ask for anything. She sat quietly, her hands folded over her bare, her eyes fixed on the endless blue beyond the glass. Andrew glanced at her and asked, "What's your name?" "Lily," she said softly. He nodded. "That's a nice name." She smiled faintly. "Mom said it means hope." He hesitated, then said, "That's a good thing to be named after." For the rest of the flight, they didn't talk much. She dozed off eventually, her head leaning gently against his arm, and though he tried not to move, he found himself resting his hand carefully over hers. It was such a small, human thing, but it felt like the first real connection he'd had in years. When the flight attendant passed by again, she stopped to look at them, and there was something in her eyes, a quiet recognition that sometimes strangers meet not by chance, but by design. By the time the plane began its descent, Andrew realized he didn't want the flight to end. The seat beside him, which had been his by assignment, no longer felt like his alone. It belonged to something larger, to a moment suspended between earth and sky, between loss and the fragile beginnings of something that might, just might, be called healing. As the plane touched down and the engines slowed, Lily opened her eyes and looked at him again. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" he asked. "For letting me sit closer to her," she said simply. And with those words, a man who had built his life on logic and control felt the first flicker of something he hadn't known in years: faith. Not in God, not in luck, but in the strange, beautiful ways life finds to bring broken souls together. The flight had settled into the gentle rhythm of the sky, the steady hum of the engines weaving through the soft chime of glasses and quiet conversation. Outside the window, clouds drifted like islands of light, and the sunlight broke through them in wide, golden bands. Inside, however, everything between the man and the little girl felt strangely still, as if the rest of the world had dimmed just enough to let this one moment exist. Andrew Blake had flown countless times before, always in silence, always alone, his mind occupied with business deals and mergers and the comforting predictability of numbers. But this flight was different. Every few minutes, his eyes wandered to the small figure beside him, the child sitting cross-legged in her seat, still holding the teddy bear as though letting go of it would make her disappear. She hadn't spoken since takeoff. Sometimes her eyes flicked toward the window, as if searching for something she expected to find in the endless blue beyond the glass. Andrew didn't know how to speak to children anymore. He had forgotten the cadence of gentle words, the way a voice had to soften to be heard by someone fragile. But after an hour of silence, he cleared his throat and said, "You like flying, Lily?" The girl turned her head slowly, blinking as if his voice had pulled her out of a dream. "It's okay," she said after a pause. "I just don't like when it ends." He frowned slightly. "Why's that?" She looked at her bear, then up at him. "Because when it ends, she's far away again." Her words were quiet but heavy, like small stones dropped into still water. He didn't know how to respond. It was such a simple truth for her and such an impossible one for him. The man who once commanded empires couldn't find the right words for a 6-year-old child. "I think," he said carefully, "she's closer than you think." Lily's brow furrowed. "How do you know?" He hesitated. "Because people we love don't go very far. They stay here." He touched his chest lightly. "Even if we can't see them anymore." She nodded slowly, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. Then, after a while, she whispered, "That's what Mommy used to say too." And that was the moment when something inside him twisted, because the words she repeated were the same ones his wife, Claire, had told their son when the boy was afraid of thunderstorms. He remembered the sound of her voice, the way she had knelt beside their son's bed and whispered, "The people we love are never gone, they just live inside the parts of us that remember." It had been a lifetime ago. He had buried that memory beneath layers of noise and success, but now it was alive again, carried on the voice of a little girl with blue eyes and trembling hands. The flight attendant stopped by to offer meals, but Lily shook her head. "I'm not hungry," she said politely, her fingers still tangled in the bear's fur. Andrew ordered coffee but didn't drink it. He kept watching her, studying her in a way that made him feel strange. There was a calmness about her, but it wasn't the calm of peace, it was the calm that came after too much loss. Children were supposed to fidget, to laugh, to ask endless questions, but she sat there perfectly still, her mind clearly somewhere else. "Where are you going?" he asked finally. She glanced at him. "To New York," she said. "My aunt lives there." He nodded. "That's a big city." "I've never been," she said. "Mom said we would go together one day, but she had to go to the sky first." Her tone was so matter-of-fact that it broke him more than tears could have. He wanted to say something comforting, but everything sounded small in comparison to what she had already endured. "Your aunt will be happy to see you," he said instead, his voice low. She shrugged. "Maybe. She doesn't like kids very much." The plane hit a patch of turbulence then, a sudden dip that made a few passengers gasp. Lily's eyes widened, and she gripped the armrest tightly. Without thinking, Andrew reached over and placed his hand gently on hers. "It's all right," he said, steady and calm. "We're safe." She looked at him, her lip trembling slightly, and then her shoulders relaxed. "You don't get scared?" she asked. "Not anymore," he said quietly, though that wasn't true. He was terrified, of the memories that haunted him, of the ghosts that lived behind his calm exterior, of the fact that this child could see through the armor he had built around himself. When the turbulence passed, she asked, "Why are you going to New York?" He hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "For work," he said after a moment. "I have meetings there." She tilted her head. "Do you like your work?" He gave a short, humorless laugh. "I used to." "And now?" she pressed. He looked out the window before answering. "Now it just keeps me busy." "So you don't have to think," she said, almost innocently. The words landed with quiet precision. He turned to look at her, and for the first time, he realized she wasn't just a child. She was someone who understood grief too well for her age. Hours passed, but time didn't move in its usual way. It stretched and folded between their silences. Somewhere over the Atlantic, she fell asleep, her head resting lightly against his arm. He should have moved, but he didn't. Instead, he looked down at her and felt the strangest sense of peace, like he was finally allowed to breathe after years of holding it in. He studied the way her fingers clung to the bear even in sleep, the tiny freckles across her nose, the soft rhythm of her breathing. He remembered his son sleeping like that, and for a fleeting second, he let the memory exist without running from it. When the plane began its descent, Lily stirred. She blinked and sat up, rubbing her eyes. "Are we there?" she asked. "Almost," he said. She turned to look out the window, watching as the city appeared below them, tiny buildings glinting in the morning light, cars like ants tracing the edges of streets. "It looks like stars," she whispered. "Just upside down." He smiled faintly. "It does." As the wheels touched down, he felt something unfamiliar, a sense of responsibility, of connection. He had no reason to feel it, she was a stranger, a child he had met only hours ago. And yet, as they waited to disembark, he found himself asking, "Is someone meeting you when we land?" "My aunt," she said again, though she didn't sound certain. She promised. He nodded slowly, though a part of him already knew promises were not always kept. When the doors opened and passengers began to leave, he stood and offered her his hand. "Come on, Lily. Let's make sure she's there." She hesitated for just a moment, then took his hand. It was small and warm and trembling slightly. Together, they stepped out into the bright, echoing corridor of the airport. The noise of arrivals washed over them, voices, announcements, the shuffle of hurried feet, but in the middle of it all, Andrew realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't walking through life alone. And though he didn't know it yet, that small hand in his was about to change everything he thought he knew about love, loss, and the long road back to the sky. The airport was crowded with the usual chaos of arrivals, people rushing to reunite with family, tired travelers dragging suitcases, voices blending into a constant echo of movement and emotion. The overhead announcements carried the same mechanical calm that no one truly listened to, and yet, in the middle of all that noise, Andrew found himself standing still, his hand still holding Lily's. The little girl looked around uncertainly, her eyes darting between faces, searching for one she hoped to see. Her yellow suitcase stood beside her like a silent companion, slightly scuffed at the edges, the handle wrapped in a pink ribbon. "Do you see her?" Andrew asked gently, scanning the crowd himself. Lily shook her head. "She said she'd be here." Her voice was small, as though she was trying to convince herself. Minutes passed. People came and went. The stream of travelers began to thin, and still no one approached. Andrew checked his watch, then pulled out his phone. "What's your aunt's name?" he asked. "Margaret," Lily said, gripping her teddy bear tightly. "Aunt Maggie." He gave a short nod and signaled one of the flight attendants, who was now helping other unaccompanied minors reunite with family. "Excuse me," he said, "the person who was supposed to meet her isn't here." The attendant frowned, checked the paperwork, and made a quick call. Her face changed as she listened, and when she hung up, she looked at Andrew with visible discomfort. "Sir, it seems the contact number listed for her aunt isn't active. The emergency contact also doesn't respond." Lily was watching them both, her blue eyes wide with confusion. "Maybe she's late," she said quickly. "She's always late." The flight attendant knelt down, her voice gentle. "Sweetheart, maybe we can wait for a bit longer, okay?" But Andrew could see the uncertainty in her eyes. He'd seen that same look in boardrooms when bad news was about to drop, that subtle shift between confidence and pity. He didn't like it now any more than he did then. "What happens if no one comes?" he asked quietly. "Standard procedure," the attendant said reluctantly. "We'll contact social services. They'll take her to a temporary care home until her family can be located." Lily's small shoulders tensed. She didn't say anything, but Andrew saw the way her knuckles whitened around the teddy bear, the way her lip trembled before she bit it to keep from crying. Something inside him hardened. He didn't know this child, she wasn't his responsibility, not by law or blood or any reason that made sense. But there was something about the image of her being led away into the bureaucratic abyss of social care that made him feel physically ill. He remembered the night he had lost his own family, the silence of the house afterward, the echo of absence. He couldn't bear the thought of another child knowing that kind of emptiness again. "I'll stay," he said finally. "Until they find her aunt." The flight attendant hesitated. "Sir, that's not really necessary." "It is," he interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You can tell them she's not alone." She looked uncertain but eventually nodded, grateful and uneasy all at once. Andrew turned back to Lily. "Let's get something to eat," he said, his voice softer now. "You must be hungry." She hesitated, then nodded slowly. They ended up in a quiet corner of an airport cafe. The smell of coffee and baked bread filled the air, but Lily didn't touch the sandwich he bought her. She just picked at the crusts and stared out the window at the airplanes taxiing down the runway. "She's probably just stuck in traffic," she said again. Andrew didn't argue. Maybe, he said. But if she doesn't come tonight, we'll figure something out. She looked at him curiously. Why are you helping me? The question was simple, but it cut straight through him. He took a slow breath before answering. Because someone should have helped me once, and they didn't. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt heavy but alive. He watched as she finally took a bite of her sandwich, chewing slowly, her small hands trembling less now. When she finished, she asked, "Do you have kids?" He froze. The question hit him like a physical blow. "I did," he said quietly. "A boy. His name was Michael." Her eyes brightened a little. "Where is he?" He hesitated, staring at the untouched cup of coffee in front of him. "He's in the sky too," he said finally. Lily didn't ask anything else. She simply nodded and looked back at the planes. "Then maybe he knows my mom," she said. "Maybe they're friends now." That night, when it became clear that no one was coming, the airline arranged for a social worker to meet them. The woman arrived with a clipboard and a tired smile, speaking in the kind of rehearsed kindness reserved for difficult situations. "Thank you for staying with her, Mr. Blake," she said, shaking his hand. "We'll take it from here." Lily stood beside her, clutching her bear, her suitcase beside her. She looked at Andrew, and her eyes filled with something that twisted in his chest, fear and trust mixed into one silent plea. "I'll be okay," she whispered, but he could tell she didn't believe it. As she started to follow the woman, Andrew heard himself say, "Wait." Both turned. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to think of the right words, but there weren't any. "Is there any way I can stay in touch?" The social worker gave a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We'll see what we can do, sir, but usually, just make sure she's safe," he said quietly. "Please." She nodded and led Lily away. He watched until they disappeared down the corridor, until the echoes of their footsteps were swallowed by the hum of the terminal. He didn't go straight home. Instead, he sat in his car in the parking lot, the rain starting to fall in soft, rhythmic taps against the windshield. He didn't start the engine. He just sat there, thinking about her words, her small hand holding onto that bear, her calm voice saying, "This seat is the closest to the sky." He didn't know why her story had settled under his skin the way it had, why he couldn't shake the image of her sitting alone among strangers, waiting for someone who would never come. Maybe because he knew what it felt like, to wait for something that wouldn't return. Maybe because, for the first time in 5 years, the emptiness inside him had found a sound. That night, he didn't sleep. He poured himself a drink, then another, sitting in the quiet of his home overlooking the ocean. The house was large, beautiful, and cold. Everything about it screamed success, but it felt like a mausoleum. As he stared out at the rain-soaked waves, he thought about calling the social worker again, about checking on the girl, about doing something he couldn't quite name. But then he told himself it wasn't his place. He had done enough. It was over. And yet, when morning came, he was already searching for the phone number he'd written on the back of a napkin at the cafe. Because some things, no matter how hard you try to walk away from them, don't let you go. The following morning, the sun rose pale and indifferent over the city, and Andrew sat at his kitchen table staring at a cold cup of coffee that he hadn't touched. He had told himself that by today he would have forgotten about the girl, that she would have been safely delivered to someone who cared, that whatever strange pull he had felt toward her was only temporary, the consequence of exhaustion and sentimentality. But when he closed his eyes, all he saw was her small face pressed against the airplane window, the reflection of clouds in her blue eyes, and the sound of her voice saying that her mother was in the sky. He tried to distract himself with work, reading through emails and reports that demanded his attention, but every number blurred into the same meaningless string of symbols. His world had been built on control, on logic, on the unshakable belief that money and order could shield him from chaos. Yet now, a child he'd known for less than a day had torn open a door inside him that he had kept locked for years. By mid-morning, he couldn't stand it anymore. He called the number the social worker had given him, telling himself it was only to confirm that she had been placed somewhere safe. The woman's voice was polite but guarded when she answered. "Mr. Blake, yes, I remember you," she said. "Lily is currently at a temporary care home until we can locate her next of kin." He asked if anyone had contacted them yet, if there had been any word from the aunt. There was a pause, then the woman sighed. "No, sir. We've tried the listed numbers, but so far, no response. We'll continue to search." He could tell by her tone that "continue to search" meant we'll add her name to a growing list and hope for the best. Something inside him twisted. "Can I visit her?" he asked before he could stop himself. The woman hesitated, clearly caught off guard. "Visits aren't typically allowed for non-family members, Mr. Blake. But given the circumstances of how you met her, I can make an exception. She might appreciate a familiar face." That afternoon, he drove to the address she gave him. The building was gray and worn, surrounded by a fence that tried to look cheerful with peeling paint in the shape of flowers. It was the kind of place that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old sadness. Inside, children's laughter echoed down the hallway, but it didn't sound like joy, it was too sharp, too forced. A woman at the front desk recognized him immediately, her expression a mix of curiosity and disbelief. He didn't belong here, his suit, his watch, his entire aura screamed of a different world. "You're here to see Lily," she said, and he nodded. She smiled faintly. "She talks about you a lot." They led him to a small playroom where a handful of children were sitting on the floor with crayons and broken toys. When Lily saw him, she froze. Then, without hesitation, she ran across the room and threw her arms around his waist. "You came," she said against his coat, her voice muffled. He knelt down so they were eye level. "Of course I came," he said. "I told you I would check on you." She looked at him with those same blue eyes that had undone him on the plane, and for the first time since he lost his family, he felt something pure and alive push through the numbness. They talked for a while, about nothing and everything. She told him that she didn't like the food here because it tasted like paper, and that the other kids didn't understand when she talked about her mom. She showed him the teddy bear, now a little more worn around the edges, and whispered, "He's been sad too, but I tell him it'll be okay." He smiled, but his chest ached. When it was time to leave, she asked quietly, "You'll come back, won't you?" He wanted to tell her the truth, that he didn't know what he was doing, that he had no right to interfere, that his world wasn't built for this kind of attachment. But instead, he said, "Yes, I'll come back." Driving home that evening, he realized how easily the promise had come out of his mouth and how impossible it would be for him to break it now. Over the next few days, he returned again and again. Sometimes he brought her books, sometimes small toys, sometimes just time. He learned that she loved stories about the sky but hated the sound of thunder. He learned that she drew her mother with wings because, as she explained, Mom said when people go to heaven, they get to fly. He laughed softly the first time she told him that, and she looked at him seriously and said, "You should laugh more. It makes you look less lonely." He didn't know how to answer that, but he didn't need to, because she was right. Weeks passed, and his visits became the only part of his day that felt real. His assistant began to notice the changes, how he canceled meetings, how he seemed distracted. His friends, the few he still kept, joked that maybe he was finally losing his edge. But what they didn't see was that he was finally feeling something again. He found himself looking forward to her laughter, to the way her tiny hands moved when she told a story, to the quiet moments when she'd sit beside him and hum to herself without realizing it. She had filled his world with something he hadn't realized he'd been missing, light. One evening, as he was leaving the care home, the social worker stopped him. "Mr. Blake, can I have a word?" she asked. He followed her to her office, where she closed the door behind them. "I just wanted to let you know that we still haven't been able to locate the aunt," she said. It appears she may have left the state months ago. We're starting to look into other options for Lily. What kind of options? He asked, though he already knew. Foster placement, she said gently. It's not permanent, just until we find a relative. The thought of Lily being moved again, of waking up in another strange bed surrounded by strangers, made his stomach twist. Can I help? He asked, his voice low. She looked at him curiously. Help how? He hesitated. Financially, legally, whatever it takes. I can make sure she's safe until you find someone. The woman studied him for a long moment. You understand what that means, Mr. Blake? Yes, he said. I know exactly what it means. That night, he couldn't sleep again. The rain was tapping softly against the windows, and the sound reminded him of the night he lost everything. But this time, instead of drinking, he stood by the window and thought about a little girl asleep in a gray building, clutching a teddy bear and dreaming of the sky. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about his losses or his failures. He was thinking about what he could still save. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the scars and the silence, he began to understand that perhaps this wasn't about rescuing her, it was about rescuing himself. The decision came to him not in a single moment of clarity, but in a slow accumulation of sleepless nights and quiet realizations that refused to leave him alone. For weeks, Andrew had tried to convince himself that what he felt toward Lily was nothing more than misplaced compassion, a projection of grief he had never learned to bury. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, the way her eyes lit up when he entered the room, the small voice that asked him if he was coming back tomorrow. He had spent so long living among people who only spoke to him in numbers and negotiations that he had forgotten what genuine trust looked like. And now he saw it every time that child reached for his hand without hesitation. It was terrifying, because it meant that she had already found her way into a heart he thought no longer existed. The process of becoming her guardian was far more complicated than he had imagined. There were forms, interviews, background checks, and endless questions from people who looked at him with thinly veiled skepticism. They saw a billionaire, not a man, and they couldn't understand why someone like him would involve himself with a child he wasn't related to. He sat through their questions with a quiet patience he hadn't known he possessed. Why her? One of the evaluators asked. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Because she needed someone, he said finally, and so did I. The woman writing notes looked up at him, surprised, but didn't reply. During those weeks, he continued visiting Lily every chance he got. She didn't understand exactly what was happening, only that he came more often now, that sometimes he brought folders and spoke with people in suits before coming to see her. Once, she asked him if she was in trouble, and he laughed softly, kneeling beside her. No, sweetheart, he said. You're not in trouble. I'm just trying to make sure you don't have to stay here anymore. She frowned, her small hand tracing the seam of his jacket. Then where would I go? He hesitated, because saying it aloud made it real. With me, he said quietly. She looked up, wide-eyed. Forever. He didn't know the answer then, but he smiled and said, for as long as you need. It was strange how quickly she became part of his routine, even before anything was official. His mornings began not with stock reports or meetings but with calls to the agency or to his lawyer, and his evenings were spent visiting the care home, helping her with reading or listening to her chatter about the other kids. She drew him pictures of airplanes and clouds, always with two figures, one tall and one small, sitting together by the window. He kept those drawings, folding them carefully into his briefcase like secret reminders of the person he was becoming. When the approval finally came through, he drove straight to the care home without even stopping to change out of his work clothes. The director handed him a file and smiled, though her eyes were wet. She's been waiting for this day, she said. He found Lily in the playroom, sitting cross-legged on the floor, coloring. When she saw him, she jumped to her feet, and for the first time since he met her, she ran to him without hesitation. Are we going? She asked breathlessly. He nodded, his throat tight. We're going. The drive to his house was quiet at first. Lily pressed her face to the window, watching the city pass by. Is it far? She asked after a while. A little, he said. It's by the ocean. The real one? She asked, her voice filled with awe. He smiled. The real one. She leaned back in her seat, hugging her teddy bear. Mom always wanted to see the ocean. Her voice trailed off, and then, softly, she added, maybe she can now. When they arrived, she stepped out of the car and stood there for a long time, staring up at the house. It was large, glass and stone framed against the fading light, but something about the way she looked at it made him see it differently, as if she was seeing a promise hidden in its walls. He opened the door and let her wander inside. Her footsteps echoed against the polished floors, her laughter bouncing off the empty spaces that had once been filled only with silence. She stopped in the living room and turned toward the tall windows that overlooked the ocean. It's so big, she whispered. Does it ever end? No, he said. It just keeps going. She nodded, thoughtful. Like love, right? He stared at her, speechless, then smiled faintly. Yeah. Like love. That night, he showed her the guest room he had prepared, a space that looked nothing like the cold, minimalist style that defined the rest of his home. He had chosen it carefully, with soft colors, a small bookshelf, and a quilt patterned with clouds and stars. She walked around the room slowly, touching everything as if afraid it might disappear. Then she looked at him and said, "Can I put my drawings on the wall?" "Of course," he said. "This is your room now." She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that reached her eyes, the kind that made the air feel lighter. When he tucked her in later, she looked up at him sleepily. "Can you stay until I fall asleep?" she asked. He hesitated only for a moment before sitting on the edge of the bed. "Sure," he said. She turned on her side, clutching the teddy bear. "You're different from other grown-ups," she murmured. "How's that?" he asked quietly. "You look sad, but your heart isn't mean." He felt something in his chest tighten painfully. He didn't answer. He just sat there, watching her eyelids flutter until she drifted into sleep. For a long time after that, he stayed in the room, listening to her breathing, a sound so fragile and perfect that he didn't dare move. In the days that followed, the house changed in ways he hadn't expected. It was no longer silent in the mornings. There was laughter, the sound of small footsteps racing down the hall, the faint hum of cartoons playing in the background. She filled the space with life, and in doing so, she filled the void he had carried for years. He found himself smiling more, not because he tried to, but because he couldn't help it. His colleagues noticed it too, even his assistant remarked one morning that he seemed lighter. He didn't explain why. How could he? How could he tell them that a 6-year-old girl had done what therapy, money, and time could not, that she had taught him how to feel again? Still, some nights he woke up with the old ache, the memories of the crash that had taken his wife and son. Those were the nights he'd walk down the hallway and find himself standing by her door, listening to her soft breathing. It comforted him in a way nothing else could. Once, when he couldn't sleep, he sat on the porch watching the ocean and heard her small voice behind him. "You're thinking about them again," she said. He turned, startled, but she was standing there in her pajamas, barefoot, holding her bear. "I miss them," he said simply. "Me too," she whispered, though she was talking about her mother. She climbed into his lap and rested her head against his chest. "Do you think they're proud of us?" she asked. He swallowed hard. "I hope so. I think they are," she said. "Because we're not broken anymore." He didn't answer, but the truth of her words settled deep inside him. They sat there together for a long time, listening to the waves and the faint whisper of wind through the trees. The stars stretched endlessly above them, the same ones that had looked down on everything he had lost and everything he had found again. For the first time in years, he felt whole, not because the past was gone, but because something new had taken root in its place. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't planned, but it was real. And as he held the small child who had unknowingly rebuilt his shattered world, Andrew understood that sometimes, the people who save us are the ones we were never supposed to meet. Andrew's life had always been predictable, a calendar of meetings, flights, and numbers that rarely changed. But ever since Lily had come into his home, predictability had turned into something else entirely. Mornings were now filled with the sound of cartoons echoing from the living room, with small feet pattering across the floor as she ran to greet him when he returned from work. His house, once a hollow structure of glass and silence, was now alive with laughter, with the scent of pancakes on Sundays, and with the feeling of belonging that he hadn't felt in years. Yet even as his life began to take on new warmth, a quiet fear lived in the background of his thoughts. Happiness, for him, had always come with a cost, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the universe didn't give second chances without demanding something in return. It was during one of his meetings that he received the call that would test everything he had built with her. He excused himself from the boardroom when he saw the number, recognizing it immediately as the social worker's. Her voice on the other end was calm but carried a weight that made his stomach tighten. "Mr. Blake, I need to inform you that Lily's aunt has come forward," she said. For a moment, he couldn't speak. "Her aunt?" he finally managed. "Yes," the woman continued, "Margaret Evans. She claims she was unaware of the situation until recently and is requesting custody." The words hit him like a slow, deliberate blow. "She wants to take her," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "That is her intention," the social worker replied. "Legally, she has the right to petition for custody as her closest blood relative." That evening, he sat at the kitchen table while Lily colored next to him, humming softly to herself. He couldn't bring himself to tell her. He watched her carefully shading in the wings of an angel she had drawn, her tongue sticking out slightly in concentration, and the thought of losing her was unbearable. "I made her bigger this time," Lily said suddenly, holding up her drawing. "Because if Mom's up in the sky, she needs big wings to fly higher." His throat tightened. "That's beautiful," he said quietly, and she smiled, returning to her crayons. He excused himself to his office, closing the door behind him before his composure broke. Over the following days, his world began to feel fragile again. The agency scheduled meetings, assessments, and hearings. Margaret Evans arrived from another state, a woman in her late 30s with tired eyes and a voice that carried equal parts guilt and resolve. When they met, she thanked him for caring for Lily, but there was a distance in her tone, a defensiveness that told him she already saw him as an obstacle. "I didn't know she was left alone," she said quietly. "I would have come sooner if I had." Andrew didn't doubt her sincerity, but sincerity didn't make this easier. "She's been through a lot," he said. "Please be sure you're ready for what that means." Margaret's eyes softened slightly. "I know," she said, "but she's family. She belongs with me." The legal process was exhausting. Every question cut deeper than the last. Lawyers asked about his suitability, his past, his motivations. They wanted to know why a man like him, a powerful, wealthy businessman, would want to take in a child with no connection to him. The implication was clear: they thought he was compensating for something, trying to atone. And perhaps, in a way, he was. But that didn't make his love for her any less real. When it was Lily's turn to speak, she was small and frightened, clutching her teddy bear. When the judge asked who she wanted to live with, her voice trembled. "I love my aunt," she said softly, "but Mr. Blake makes the bad dreams go away." The room went still. The judge's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, but Andrew saw it. After the hearing, he waited outside with her. The courthouse steps felt impossibly long, and the world beyond them seemed heavier than ever. Lily sat beside him, her head resting against his arm. "Did I say the wrong thing?" she asked. "No," he said. "You said what you felt." She looked up at him. "Then why do you look sad?" He smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Because sometimes, even when you tell the truth, the world doesn't listen. Weeks passed before the final decision. Each day felt like an eternity, each moment stretched between hope and despair. He tried to keep things normal for her, school, bedtime stories, visits to the beach, but the weight of uncertainty hung over everything. Then, one gray afternoon, the call came. The court had decided that while Margaret Evans would retain legal custody, Lily would remain with Andrew for an extended guardianship period while the transition took place. It wasn't permanent, but it wasn't a goodbye either. When he hung up, he felt both relief and heartbreak. That night, as he tucked her into bed, she looked at him sleepily. "Are you going to leave too?" she asked. He froze, then shook his head. "Never," he said. "You're stuck with me, kid." She smiled faintly. "Good," she murmured, drifting into sleep. He sat beside her for a long time afterward, staring at the soft glow of the nightlight, and he realized that no matter what papers said or what courts decided, she was already part of him. She wasn't just the little girl he had helped, she was the reason he had learned to breathe again. The transition plan lasted months, and during that time, he met with Margaret often. Slowly, the walls between them began to crumble. She saw how Lily looked at him, how safe she felt in his presence, and something in her expression changed. One evening, as they stood outside the care facility where the final paperwork was being reviewed, Margaret turned to him. "You know," she said, "I thought I was here to take her back. But maybe she's already home." Her words hung in the air like a fragile truth. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. That night, when he came home, Lily ran to meet him at the door, barefoot and laughing, her teddy bear dangling from one arm. She stopped suddenly, studying his face. "Did she take me away?" she asked. He knelt, pulling her into a hug. "No," he whispered. "You're staying right where you are." She wrapped her small arms around his neck and whispered back, "Then we're both home now." For the first time since he lost his family, Andrew understood that love didn't erase pain, it transformed it. It didn't fix what was broken, it gave the broken a place to belong. And as he held that small, fragile girl in his arms, the man who once lived only for control, wealth, and success realized that everything he had ever wanted had been waiting for him in the eyes of a child who believed that his heart wasn't mean. Time passed in a strange, unhurried rhythm that neither of them seemed to notice. Seasons changed, the ocean shifted moods outside their window, and the house continued to evolve into something alive, no longer the cold monument it once was. Lily grew taller, her hair longer and lighter from the sun, her laughter more confident, though the traces of her early sadness never disappeared completely, they lingered in her eyes like soft shadows. Andrew, too, had changed. The lines of exhaustion and grief that once carved his face had softened, replaced by something that resembled peace. He still carried his past inside him, but it no longer defined him. The man who had built his life on control and isolation now found himself kneeling to tie shoelaces, burning pancakes, and explaining why rainbows couldn't be kept in jars. His life had become messy, unpredictable, full of small miracles, and he wouldn't have traded any of it for all the power and success in the world. Still, the peace he had found was fragile. There were moments, especially late at night, when he caught himself wondering when it would all fall apart. Happiness, he had learned, came with a kind of fear, as if life might notice and take it away out of spite. And so when the phone rang one rainy morning, and the social worker's voice came through again, calm but hesitant, that fear returned in an instant. "Mr. Blake," she said, "there's something you should know. Lily's father has been located." The words felt distant at first, like they belonged to someone else's story. "Her father," he repeated. "Yes," the woman continued, "he had been incarcerated but was released 2 months ago. He's been looking for her." The conversation that followed blurred in his memory. He remembered asking about details, about legalities, about whether the man had any right to claim her after so long. The social worker explained that he did, that the law recognized biological ties first, and that a hearing would be scheduled to determine custody. After he hung up, Andrew sat in silence for a long time, staring at the ocean outside. The sky was heavy, the water gray and restless, and he felt the same turbulence inside himself. He didn't know this man, but the idea of someone taking her away, someone who hadn't been there when she cried herself to sleep, who hadn't watched her heal, was unbearable. He told himself he wouldn't let her see his fear. When Lily came home from school that day, dripping wet from the rain, he smiled and asked her about her day, listening as she talked about a spelling test and a friend who'd shared her lunch. But that night, after she had gone to bed, he sat in his study with the old photo album she had made with construction paper and glue. On the first page was a drawing of the two of them, her stick figure self holding hands with a taller figure labeled Mr. Blake. Underneath, in her uneven handwriting, she had written, "My family." He closed the book and pressed it to his chest. The hearing came faster than he expected. The man, Daniel Carter, was introduced to him in the hallway outside the courtroom. He was younger than Andrew imagined, maybe mid-30s, with tired eyes and hands that trembled slightly as he held his hat. He looked nothing like a villain, he looked like someone broken by time and regret. "You're the one who's been taking care of her," Daniel said quietly. "Thank you." His voice was rough, not unkind, but heavy with shame. Andrew didn't know how to respond. He wanted to hate him, to see in him the kind of man who deserved to lose. But looking at him, all he saw was another person who had suffered. Inside the courtroom, Lily sat between them, holding her teddy bear as if it were armor. When the judge asked if she knew who Daniel was, she nodded slowly. "He's my dad," she said softly, then looked at Andrew. "But Mr. Blake is my home." The silence that followed was unbearable. Andrew's throat tightened, and when he met Daniel's eyes, he saw tears there too. The hearing went on for hours. Lawyers argued, documents were read, and at the end, the judge announced that an extended evaluation period would take place before any permanent decision was made. Lily would continue living with Andrew for now, but visitation rights would be granted to Daniel. The first visit was awkward and painful. Daniel came to the house one Saturday morning, nervous and quiet. Lily hid behind Andrew's leg at first, peeking out from behind him. "It's okay," Andrew whispered. "You can talk to him." She stepped forward hesitantly. Daniel knelt down. "You've grown so much," he said softly. "You look just like your mom." She didn't answer, but she didn't run away either. Andrew stayed nearby, watching, his chest tight. For hours, he watched them talk, laugh a little, then fall silent again. When it was over, Daniel shook Andrew's hand. "You've done more for her than I ever could," he said. "Whatever the court decides, thank you for giving her a life I couldn't." That night, after Daniel left, Lily came into Andrew's study. She stood there for a while, silent, then asked, "Do you want me to go live with him?" He felt his heart stop. "No," he said quickly. "I want you to be where you're happy." She tilted her head, thinking. "Then I'm already there," she said simply, climbing onto his lap. He wrapped his arms around her and held her tightly, realizing that love, in its truest form, was not about possession, it was about choosing someone again and again, even when the world kept trying to take them away. As the months went on, something unexpected began to happen. Daniel didn't disappear like Andrew had feared, instead, he kept visiting. Slowly, he became part of their strange, fragile circle. Lily began to trust him, and Andrew found himself no longer seeing him as an enemy but as another piece of Lily's story. They started spending time together, going to the park, sharing meals, laughing. It was awkward, imperfect, but real. And through it all, Andrew began to feel something he hadn't expected, peace. One evening, as the three of them stood on the porch watching the sun sink into the ocean, Lily slipped her small hands into both of theirs. "Now I have two dads," she said proudly. Neither man corrected her. They simply looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. Life had not gone the way any of them had planned, but somehow, in its chaos, it had given them something greater than what they thought they'd lost. Later that night, after Lily had fallen asleep, Daniel turned to Andrew. "I don't think I could ever take her away from you," he said quietly. "She's your daughter as much as she is mine." Andrew nodded slowly. "She's ours," he said. "In every way that matters." The words felt right, simple and true. They sat there in silence, the sound of waves filling the spaces between them. For the first time in years, Andrew felt the weight lift completely. He had built skyscrapers and companies, but this was the only thing he had ever built that truly mattered. The night ended quietly, without words, only a shared sense of peace that neither man had known before. In the room down the hall, a little girl slept soundly, dreaming not of loss, but of home. And in that moment, Andrew realized that love wasn't about keeping what you lost, it was about opening your heart wide enough to let the broken pieces fit together again, no matter how unlikely the shape. The years that followed unfolded slowly, gently, like a sunrise that no one dared to rush. Time did not erase what had been broken, but it softened the edges of grief, allowing something new to grow in its place. Andrew often thought about how his life had changed in ways he could never have imagined. There was a time when he believed happiness was something bought, structured, earned through success and control. Now he understood that happiness was built out of fragile moments, the kind that couldn't be planned. A hand slipped into his during a walk, laughter echoing down the hallway, the smell of pancakes burning in the morning because Lily had insisted on cooking by herself. He used to wake to silence, now he woke to her humming, to the sound of life unfolding around him. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't predictable. But it was real, and for the first time, that was enough. Lily grew fast, faster than he was ready for. By the time she turned 8, the house was filled with her drawings, colorful skies, airplanes, families holding hands beneath clouds. She called him Dad now, without hesitation, without question. The first time she did, it had been accidental. She'd been running late for school, shouting down the hall, "Dad, I can't find my shoes," and then froze, realizing what she'd said. He turned to her slowly, his throat tightening, and before he could speak, she whispered, "Can I call you that?" He couldn't answer at first. He only nodded. That single word, spoken so naturally, had done something to him that all the years of success and wealth never could. It healed him. Daniel remained in their lives too, though his role changed with time. He visited often, joining them for holidays, birthdays, sometimes even for no reason at all. He and Andrew had developed a quiet friendship, born not of similarity but of shared understanding. They were two men bound by love for the same child and by the realization that love didn't have to compete. Daniel had found steady work and rebuilt his life, though he admitted one evening, sitting on Andrew's porch, that he wasn't sure he ever would have made it without knowing Lily was safe. "You saved her," he said, "but you saved me too." Andrew didn't respond, only looked out at the sea, knowing that what they had both endured had shaped them into something better than before. Lily never forgot where she came from, but she no longer looked at the world through loss. She spoke of her mother often, but her words were peaceful now, not haunted. "She's not gone," she told Andrew once. "She's just in a different sky." It was something she had believed since that day on the airplane, and he never had the heart to tell her otherwise. Maybe she was right. Maybe heaven was just another kind of sky, and maybe their loved ones really did watch from somewhere above. Every evening before bed, she would press her face against the window, searching the stars, and whisper goodnight to her mother and to Michael, the son Andrew had lost. He never told her to